So we might change things up, but welcome. So this week we're going to be talking about the nature of the decision making in the postmortal. So we've talked a lot, I think, given how much we've talked at all, about what it means to decide to take the cure or decide to be immortal. And so it's going to be kind of the theme for this week. We're entering into some secondary literature. We're going to be bouncing back and forth between making progress in the postmortal and then having some secondary reading to kind of frame how we might talk about the themes in the postmortal. After the second section, I think we're in a pretty good place to think about how people are making decisions about taking the cure. And I'd like us to think about how you're standing with it, with regards to deciding to take something like the cure and things like that. So up to this point, we've read section 1 and section 2. And it's structured pretty nicely for this question. So if you recall, back in section 1, the cure wasn't decriminalized. And so we're getting a lot of people's perspectives on whether they would take it or not, right? So of course, we're reading this book through the lens of John Farrell. So it opens with his thoughts about him going to the fake little clinic in the apartment complex to take the cure, right? So we get 2 weeks of him ruminating on his concerns, his pros, his cons on taking this cure, right? So we get a lot of his thinking there. But we also get, this is one of the things I like about this text, through his lens, what a number of other people's thoughts are about whether to take the cure or not, right? So in section 1, we get a perspective on what his dad thinks about taking the cure, right? His dad has serious reservations, and Farrell is kind of surprised about that. His dad's considerations don't quite resonate with him, right? We also get a perspective from his roommate, Katie, right? Farrell also doesn't quite relate to Katie's exuberance, but they're kind of in line insofar as they're both like, yeah, let's do it. Just maybe not quite to the same degree. We also get Farrell's interpretation of his sister's concerns, right? And I mean, if any of you have siblings, you might feel maybe sometimes overinterpreted by them, or maybe you think sometimes, oh, I gotta check myself, I'm overinterpreting what they're saying, right? So that's to say just, we wanna keep in mind we're not getting just an objective take on what's going on in this world, on what all the characters are thinking, right? We're getting a take on a sister's view, right? So we're getting what Farrell thinks his sister is doing and saying, and things like that. Similarly, we're getting a son who's not quite understanding his father's perspective, so his take on his dad might skew or be a little exaggerated, but still one thing I like about section 1 is we're getting a lot of information about different views on what we might be concerned about in taking the cure or what may be exciting about taking the cure, right? So this week for our thread or our theme or our topic, kind of thinking about that in section 1, right? So those are 4 characters that I think we might be able to hone in on, right? So Farrell, his dad, his roommate Katie, and his sister Polly, right? So we think with Katie, like, oh, we get to live forever and party. With dad, he's like, I'm living fine, but I like a lifespan. I'm looking forward to joining people I love in the afterlife, right? He misses his wife. He's been able to live through seeing his children grow up, right? And with Polly, at least through the lens of her brother, she's a mom. She has a great marriage. Family structure is really important to her, and she's worried about what her husband is going to value, right? So we have a lot of different things that people are taking as important in their life that the cure interacts with differently. It might amplify some and be exciting, like Katie and maybe John are emphasizing, or it might start undermining things that we take to be valuable, like what his dad and Polly are thinking about. Okay, so in section 1, we get a lot of setup, right? We have a lot of considerations about why we might take the cure. That's not to say there aren't a lot of important plot points happening in section 1 that we're going to be returning to as we draw out other threads. But for this week, thinking about decision making. Okay, so then for last week, we read section 2. The cure has been decriminalized, and it's even called the spread. A lot of things are happening at rapid acceleration, right? So we see a lot of effects of the cure being decriminalized in the US, right? In section 1, we saw there were already effects happening in other countries where the cure was widely available. But because our main characters that I've just mentioned are in the US, let's focus on the US for this week. Okay. So things that are changing. People's perspective on family units is how the section even starts out, right? So we have a clash between Farrell and his then girlfriend Sonia on what the expectations are around marriage and children, right? So again, it's varied from Farrell's perspective, how he characterizes Sonia and her thinking, but we see that as a theme throughout section 2, just different ideas about marriage, children, and family. And one thing to note there is that the cure happens, and it's not like everyone now has the same change in their ideas about marriage and family, right? We kick it off with just 2 people who have taken the cure and differ, right? Similarly, we can see how Polly's concerns might be manifesting, right? They might be coming to fruition in section 2. Farrell's a lawyer, and we see in section 2 rich folk opting for a different structure of marriage. Again, not everybody, right? So in section 2, we can kind of see maybe the extent to which or the limit to which some of the folks who are thinking in section 1, what their concerns, how reasonable their concerns were, whether they actually came to fruition or whether they didn't, right? So thinking in section 2, the shifts in marriage and children standards, right? We have the freezer mom as an outlier case. We have cycle marriages becoming something that is common to talk about or consider, even if everybody's not on the same page about them. And we also have people who are just radically against the cure and how that factors into society, right? We have different ideas of what it means to have a legacy. So an impact on sports and athletes. Now that the cure exists, they're changing ideas about genetic interference, right? So we have an idea of organic children versus children who have been genetically manipulated, right? And different values regarding that. So thinking in section 2, how much the people in section 1 were making a decision that was informed, right? That can be a major question, right? So as I was asking you, just like back on day 1, like now maybe a month ago, I don't even know what time is anymore. I doubt many of us do. Thinking about like, hey, how many of you would take the cure? When in your life would you take the cure? Now seeing the relationship between even just section 1 and section 2, right? We're gonna be jumping in the future next week into section 3, but now we have a little bit of like what would change. We can think about how informed our just knee-jerk choice would actually be, right? Because we can anticipate some changes in society, right? We're trying. And also we can challenge whether McGarry in this book actually is getting it right, like this is actually how it would change. But one thing that we're gonna be thinking about this week is what kind of choice are we making when it's such a big one, right? Whether you want to take the cure or not is not the same as like, should I take a Tylenol for my headache? Okay, so trying to think about why, in what way it's different is the subject of our reading for this week. So what makes taking the cure or not a different kind of choice than should I have a taco or a burger for lunch? Because we make choices all the time that could have like a butterfly effect, where like a butterfly in Brazil causes a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, right? It seems different. Okay, so textually speaking, that's how I want us to think about what we've read so far. People are considering the decision in 1, and we see a bit of how it unfolds in 2. So were they making an informed decision? Were they right or wrong? How can we evaluate their decision? Based on our reading for this week with L.A. Paul. So saying a little bit about our reading for this week. part 2 of our talk this week. Sweet, sorry this video is a bit long. So that's my little dance break. Okay. L.A. Paul. She's a contemporary philosopher, really well known. Here's her most famous thing. She wrote this book called Transformative Experiences that does a few things. It challenges what it means to make a rational, informed, authentic choice, right? So as you might anticipate, in philosophy land, where I grew up and currently teach mostly, we really love rational, informed decisions. That's like the holy grail of human action. But as L.A. Paul points out, a lot of our really big major life choices don't meet that standard. And she suggests that it's for a very particular reason. So if you know, on 761 to 762 of our text, I read out the quote, she says, the ideal rational agent acts authentically by reflecting on how she wants to realize her future, right? So reflecting, what do I want in the future? And perhaps how she wants to realize herself as a certain kind of person before she makes her choice. So the idea is, when I decide what I want in the future, I imaginatively project myself into the future. So when making a choice rather, about whether I want a taco or a burger for lunch, I imagine myself maybe eating the burger and eating the taco, and which one do I want to do more? So I'm like, okay, Meredith at this time, right? Put myself into the perspective of Meredith eating a taco and Meredith eating a burger, and I think Meredith eating a taco is having a better time. Maybe because she's saving money, maybe because Meredith likes tacos more right now, maybe because the places in which I eat either option, one is more pleasant, maybe one's closer than the other, right? But what I'm doing is I'm imagining myself in those circumstances. Awesome. So that's typically how we make most decisions, according to most philosophers, right? So we're taking our preferences, our values, our desires, our understanding of ourselves, right? And we're projecting it into these possible options and deciding which one fits best. The problem comes about with transformative experiences. So with those choices, in making the choice, we're transformed by making the choice, right? So we kind of become a different person. What does that mean? So right now, Meredith, I have values and preferences and priorities and a self-understanding. With some choices, my priorities would shift. My values might shift. So it's hard or impossible for me to imaginatively project myself into those places because I don't know what I'd be like if I made those choices. The paradigmatic, or like the central case of that, is like having a first child. So if any of you have talked to somebody who's just had a kid, they're like, you don't even know the love you'll have. Oh, you can't imagine it. I'm a different person than I was before. You don't know how great it is, or how horrible it is, right? Your highs have never been higher, your lows have never been lower, right? Okay, so in making the choice to become a parent, you're changing what you value. You're changing your whole perspective on life. That isn't to say that people can't make that choice. We do it all the time, right? All that it's saying is when you're making that choice, you're not able to imaginally project you into that. You're deciding to change yourself. And we do that. Like when I don't have children, thank God. That wouldn't be good for anybody. But for instance, like when I decided to go to grad school, right? That I couldn't imagine myself in grad school. It's a radically different experiences. There's pressures coming from different places that I've ever had before in my life. Nevertheless, I decided to go to grad school, right? It's not like that's an impossible decision. People decide to have first children, right? It's just that you're not making it from the like philosophically speaking, like rational ideal place. So L.A. Paul argues that when we're making transformative experiences, we're making it from a place of discovery and transformation, right? So she's not talking bad about these experiences. She's just saying, maybe like we're making a leap of faith or something, right? She's suggesting that there's a limit to the degree to which we can imaginally project ourselves. Because it's not like Meredith imaginally projecting myself to grad school and then deciding whether Meredith would be better in grad school than not grad school, say. Or like, if I decided like Meredith deciding to have a first child or not, I can't do that because Meredith having a first child now becomes a different person. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. My priorities would be different. I'd have this relationship to a child that would shift my priorities, that would shift my values, right? So thinking about what it means to be a person in terms of that perspective on the world. So even if we gathered evidence, even if we listened to people, there's a limit to how much we can make an informed choice. She uses the example that I really like of becoming a vampire. It would change so much about your experience, your priorities, what it means to live in the world. You can listen to all the vampires you want. They can give you all the evidence, and still you don't quite know what it's like to be a vampire. So you can decide to be a vampire, but not based on evidence, not based on what you think you would experience as a vampire. So here's what I'd like us to think about this week. What do you think about transformative experiences? Do you think this is a definition or a category that's useful to think about in the world, right? Also, thinking about section 1 and section 2 of our book, The Postmortal, do you think transformative experiences is a useful way of considering whether to take the cure or not? Also, using these 4 characters, John Farrell, his dad, his sister Polly, and Katie, even though we kind of lose Katie a bit, but thinking about her a bit, given what they were considering and then what came about in section 2, does that support the idea that taking the cure is a transformative experience, right? So given how they were trying to make their decision and then what happened, how they became a person in section 2, does that make it look like a transformative experience? Or does the way they were considering it in section 1 and then what happened in section 2 make it not so much look transformative? Does it make it look like how we kind of consider things normally in our day-to-day? Okay, so that's what I kind of wanted to get on the table for us to consider.